Welcome to the Design of Business,
The Business of Design,
where we introduce you to people from all over the world, from different industries and disciplines,
who are here to talk about design, business, and the values that govern how we work and live together.
I'm Ellen McGirt.
And I'm Jessica Helfand.
The Design of Business, The Business of Design is brought to you by MailChimp. So you want to grow your business. Now what? MailChimp's all-in-one marketing platform allows you to manage more of your marketing activities all in one place, so you can market smarter and grow faster. Now what?
MailChimp, that's what.
Learn more at MailChimp.com. On today's episode, from design writer to state senator.
All of our lives are actually really damaged by not having enacted strong transit or having toxic schools as we do in Philadelphia, near landfill or near incinerators. I mean, you start to then think about your world in environmental or climatological terms. And you're like, well, this is terrible. We need to transform all of this entirely.
Nikhil Saval is a newly elected state senator for Pennsylvania's 1st Senate District.
He's also the author of Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace, and has written for the New York Times and the New Yorker. Nikhil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And congratulations on becoming a state senator. I think I'm just going to ask the most basic question. How are you?
I'm okay. I mean, I'm 3 weeks into the job. So on the one hand, I love the work. I find it just like enthralling, even though it's meetings all day. But it's like intellectually continually absorbing. That part has been fantastic, and I'm excited by my staff, and all that stuff is great. At the same time that this is in a pretty dire context, and so there is this other feeling where we are well into the second surge of this pandemic, and I'm in a position now to, at least in part, do something about that. And so there is like this sense of just wanting to be able to be equal to one's time, and this time is a really devastating one.
We're really thrilled to ask you so many questions, not least of which is how you went from being a design writer to becoming a politician. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey? Was that always in the cards for you?
No, I will say that it was not. And that's even true of design writer. I was not trained in the field and sort of stumbled into it. But for the political side, I mean, I guess I would say I've actually, since I've been a professional writer, that is a full-time writer, which is since about 2011, 2012, I would say that I've also been an organizer of some kind. So I got into that, frankly, because when I was working in book publishing, I had wanted to organize a union at my workplace and had no idea how to do that. And so faced with that, just not just failure, because I didn't even get anything off the ground, but just a sense of not even knowing where to start and wanting to reach out horizontally to learn to organize, I started volunteering with Unite Here, which is the union of hotel workers, hospitality workers. And it was a revelation to me. I just realized that I could be with people who looked and came from backgrounds like mine, and we could have power in a city and in workplaces and win healthcare and, shut down streets. And that was transformative for me. But it never got me into electoral politics. I would say that the thing that changed in 2016 for me was the Bernie Sanders campaign, where I became heavily involved in my neighborhood level organizing. We were able to win our section of Philadelphia for Senator Sanders in the primary that year. And then out of that, I co-founded a progressive organization called Reclaim Philadelphia, which was meant to localize a lot of the work that campaign had been doing on a national level and get people elected to state and local office. And it turns out we were able to do that. It was just suddenly, this great feeling like, oh, we can win, and we can demand more from our elected officials. I ran for a local Democratic Party office, ward leader, which is a kind of historically like a boss machine role. It involved talking to my neighbors, local organizing. I liked it. And someone posed to me the idea that I could run for state senate in February of last year. That's when I first started to consider it. And I was not horrified, I would say, by the idea. And so then, here we are.
I have a million questions about your background, but I want to dig into the richness that you just shared now. And I think I'm mostly curious about what it was like talking with your neighbors during this incredibly challenging and interesting time in the run-up to your election that you were not horrified at the prospect of. What did you hear that helped you to understand that, yes, we can organize our way into a better future together?
the thing you learned, and it's not surprising, but it just is a different experience to actually just hear it over and over again, is just how little slack there is in people's lives. I mean, people who are otherwise appear stable. This is to say nothing of people who are in deep poverty, but I mean, just among kind of working class, middle class people, a missed paycheck, it means you miss your mortgage payment, you miss your house payment, and suddenly you have eviction proceedings against you. Suddenly you're choosing between paying for groceries or paying your mortgage or rent, or that's just a lot of people. A lot of people who are, in this pandemic, who are, of course, immunocompromised. I might not have otherwise known that, but who could not go to the grocery store and didn't know the first place to go for just help. You can't listen to things like that and not act on them, and we ended up connecting to mutual aid efforts and helping people get the services they need where we could support that. I mean, we had a campaign that was very well connected to like tenants' rights organizing and things like that. So that's something that we were able to do, but it just at the scale of, how much people, when faced with an emergency, do not have a lot of recourse is enormous. And I'll say this as a freelancer, as a freelance writer, that's certainly true for me. So also just the level of precariousness in the economy among independent contractors and how many people suffer with that status. I'm one of them. And I knew that, I knew it intimately, but it's just, you need recognition. You need moments where you speak to other people who deal with it. It's just another aspect of, how things are stacked against people in our economy.
I'm curious, Nikhil, growing up in Los Angeles as you did and living in cities and writing about architecture, as I hear you talking about things like your sensitivity to tenants' rights, could you speak a little bit to the relationship between urbanism and political engagement?
It's funny. I would say that I had a fairly idealistic perspective on urbanism and what cities were for and what they sort of meant. And in a way, the level of idealism I felt around it was so disconnected from the actual reality of cities that once I had a shock to that idealism, that's what kind of provoked a political change, if that makes sense. So, and to kind of explain, growing up in Los Angeles, although I actually had this snobbish attitude towards Los Angeles, I was like, well, this is not a real city. I'm sure there is one. That's why I'm going to go to college in New York. And then it was when I went to New York that I suddenly became aware. I read Mike Davis, the historian of Southern California and the labor movement. And then novels, I think I was reading Thomas Pynchon, I read Joan Didion, I read, things that just kind of give me a greater perspective on Southern California. But all of that was to say that I think I had a very aestheticized view of cities. I was like, oh, cities are just this ballet of street life. And I didn't really think about them as economies or places where people suffered. And even though I had experienced that, my parents had to sell their home when I was growing up. They had a pizza restaurant growing up, and so the landlord sold the building, they closed the restaurant, they suddenly were without income. They sold their house and moved back to India. And so there was this very palpable sense of housing instability for me, where it was just myself and my brother, myself in college on financial aid and he on a graduate student stipend, living in the United States and not really having a clear sense of where to go or what to do at any given moment. But I just kind of insulated myself. It was really after college, I got a job in book publishing. I was living in Brooklyn in an apartment that was far too expensive for me. It was $1,000 a month. And then I was making $28,000 a year. That doesn't really pencil out. So just struggling to get by and not really sure whether I would. I remember they announced what many people may know who know of New York City development politics, the Atlantic Yards project, which was several blocks from my house. And it was at a scale of construction that seemed to me to be nowhere meeting the needs of the neighborhood or of the city. And I thought, how could this happen? How is this a project that a city sets itself on? And reporting on that project, it just shook me up. I just was scared. I was like, oh, this is what cities actually are. The fact that Frank Gehry had been the person who had been selected to design the stadium, which was called Building Miss Brooklyn. I mean, it was called Miss Brooklyn, I'm sorry. If you idealize these figures or if you have like a certain perspective on them, and then suddenly they're caught up in this venal exercise, that can be very shocking. So I would say those are the things that suddenly started to connect politics and aesthetics for me, that like those things were related.
you weren't just a writer. You got a PhD at Stanford. You were
Right.
a reader. You were an engager. You were interested in so many different forms of written expression. And yet you went from that into sort of an architectural slant into politics. And so I wonder if now, as you consider this next chapter, do you see a role for writing in your senatorial life?
Absolutely, actually. I almost actually maybe just a few weeks ago, I might have said, I don't really know. It's going to be a different kind of writing. But one, just for myself, there is a way that writing helps me focus my thoughts. So I was asked to give a talk at this Philadelphia group called the Design Advocacy Group, which brings together planners and architects and affiliated design fields. And so I thought, well, what can I talk about? And so I gave a lecture on the writer Catherine Bauer, the advocate, who is I think, a neglected figure. She wrote a book called Modern Housing in the early 20th century. She was a key architect of the 1937 Housing Act that under the New Deal that helped establish public housing, although she had many issues with the way it was enacted, and her vision was much broader than that. She was an organizer and, just was a huge figure. And so I was able to speak about her, and partly because she had a vision for social housing, a distinct model of housing for the working classes and middle classes, as well as the poor, that is derived from Europe, that was never enacted in the United States. And so reading through this history, that was like, just writing about this, I thought, oh, this clarifies my thoughts. I'm supposed to be writing about it for a magazine coming up. It just helps me to think through these issues and then publicize them in some ways.
We're living in an era where essential workers in retail and food service are actually hostages. You mentioned a couple of examples already, including independent contractors. It seems to me that government has to work with big employers to get some of this stuff done. How do you see that?
This has been, for all the talk of essential work, I mean, it's just one of the, in a way, it's one of the most just hypocritical rephrasings of the contemporary era. Just the way that essential workers have been treated in no way reflects their supposedly essential status. I mean, we have an administration who has had 10,000 OSHA violations alleged and only 2 acted on. I mean, in the last 4 years. I mean, it's incredible given what we know to be happening under the pandemic. We have gig economy workers for DoorDash, Uber, and Lyft that, in my opinion, and opinion of many legal experts and labor activists, are employees and deserve the rights of workers and don't get those rights. And I think this is wrong. And so we actually need an effort that truly recognizes the work of workers that we now broadly call essential. And that involves treating that work and those employees as employees. So one of the things that I feel very passionate about, and this partly comes from my design work and thinking about the role of Uber and Lyft and transportation networks companies in cities. It's something I've written about, and the fact that they tend to sap public transit and block and increase traffic and things like that. But that led me to thinking about the fact that the drivers for those companies are treated as these kind of app-based contractors. Of course, there's legislation around this, and that's important. This is a growing category of work. Let's treat it the way it should be treated. This is also true for home healthcare aides. This is true for a lot of delivery drivers across industries. Why shouldn't you have the same rights as any other employees? And this is something that I hope to work on in the Senate.
The Design of Business, the Business of Design, is brought to you by MailChimp. We talk to some people working for MailChimp from their homes about what creative leadership looks like in these uncertain times.
My name is Whitney Homans.
Whitney Homans is a director of content strategy. Whitney talked about how important it is to stay in touch with customers.
It really magnifies the importance of the decisions we make when you hear about the direct impacts on these small businesses and organizations in real time, right? Like it's not theoretical anymore. It's not abstract. We're not talking in percentages about how many small businesses survive. We're literally watching as businesses are faced with impossible decisions around us, and businesses that we love and organizations that we love. And so that makes it really personal, and it makes it real, and it really grounds you in what can we do? What are all the things we can do to help these businesses and these organizations in any way that we can?
MailChimp's all-in-one marketing platform allows you to manage more of your marketing activities all in one place, so you can market smarter and grow faster. Now what? MailChimp, that's what. Learn more at MailChimp.com.
I want to ask you a little bit about your constituency in Philadelphia. My whole family's from Philadelphia, and my grandparents, for years and years and years, as long as I can remember, lived on Chestnut Street at the William Penn House. So I have this image of parts of Center City that are high rises and grandparents. But I wonder, given your advocacy in terms of housing policy in particular, if you could talk a little bit about the eclectic nature of your constituents and about the homes guarantee you're fighting so hard for in Philadelphia.
Absolutely. Pennsylvania and Philly for many years used to be had relatively stable populations. Obviously, the city had been declining for many years in population, but then around 2007, according to the census, it changed. The city started to grow, and my district in particular started to grow. And the reason it grew was because of immigrants moving to the city. And so it has become a much more diverse district and much more diverse city. It is a majority minority city, but the district has multiple languages spoken. A lot of people from Southeast Asia, from East Asia, South Asia, Latin America. That's just the populations in the district. At the same time that the housing stock and the architectural variety are enormous. I mean, you mentioned the high rises in Center City. There's a lot of old, federal era housing and with the neighborhood known as Society Hills. There's like these kind of giant mansions almost in the southwest part of the city. In Eastwick, near the airport, there's places built on reclaimed landfill that have high rates of cancer, I should note, and high rates of flooding. It's just like the drama of the district in both good and bad ways is really palpable to me. There's a lot of inequality, I think is a primary word, because in some ways it's one of the richest districts in the state. At the same time that housing insecurity, especially at the margins of the district, is enormous. And so because it's a city that has come to the edge of collapse, I would say, in many ways, like it has faced the same sort of precipice that Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, a lot of these cities have faced but it did not go over. There has been a priority placed on growth and development in the center city and areas and things like that. And gentrification has been seen as largely, for a long time, was perceived as a good, and there was policies to aid that. I think now we're in a position to see the cost of it and the fact that it hasn't delivered on a lot of things it claimed to, and least of all, equity. And so the Homes Guarantee is a national proposal that we feel has relevance everywhere. So if it's a right, rights are often things that we speak of in terms that, like human rights, things that we tend to betray. But we need to guarantee it. And so the way to guarantee it is to create a number of different policies that make it possible for people to stay in their homes or to have access to housing. And we need, on the one hand, I think a huge protection for renters, people for tenants' rights, rent stabilization or control, right to counsel in the case of eviction, things like that. At the same time, we just need to be producing more housing and more affordable housing in particular. Make that possible, especially in richer neighborhoods. People should have access to transit and all the amenities that people with wealth do. We should be building in those areas and building affordable housing. We just need to return to a model where we produce it. The other thing I've just been very interested in is the green side of affordable housing. And this is Pennsylvania has actually been a little bit of a leader in this, in that it tends to award low-income housing tax credits to nonprofit housing developers that do build passive or green housing. That's a criterion. And housing is a huge source of emissions. Utilities are a huge side of housing as well. Black households in particular tend to be hugely more energy burdened than white households in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Where redlining took place tends to correlate with heat islands in cities. I also just feel like our climate initiatives are deeply bound up with our racial justice and housing initiatives. And so that's a huge part of what I'm thinking about as well.
We're living in a society that's so deeply divided, and I'm now completely struck by how we're fighting about terms that I'm not sure anybody really understands. Defund the police, democratic socialism, Green New Deal. What have you learned about having these conversations, or even branding them, or giving the short version of them that brings people closer together rather than driving them apart?
It's funny. I identify as a socialist. I ran openly as one. I found it was funny how it rarely came up. That has changed. It hasn't changed overwhelmingly, but it's obviously changed in not in most places. But that's incredible. I mean, I think it's just that people accept, a lot of people anyway, accept the kind of basic tenets of what people have identified as a socialist program, and all of them tend to be about these guarantees. We guarantee healthcare, we guarantee housing, we guarantee no one should go without these things. Is it ever a good idea to have your access to potable water shut off? No. It's just to the extent that we can just make those things common sense, the less the kind of label of socialism. It's not unimportant. It's just because it can describe a program. But the other thing, and being truthful, this is something we're going to fight about as a here putting on my hat as a Democrat in the Pennsylvania Senate. I mean, it's not widely accepted. It can be used somewhat effectively by opponents. And so whether that's our climate initiatives or wanting to invest more in social services rather than police, whether that's wanting to provide those services for free at the point of service. I mean, to the extent that we can have like a real popular economic program that is geared at people, that is not an abstraction. And sometimes it can feel like one. I think the other thing is I would say that, I have said, and I believe that a Green New Deal or like a huge, or even the kind of climate program that President-elect Biden proposed would create millions of green jobs. But for a lot of people, that's kind of not meaningful. What does that mean? Millions, like right here, I'm dealing with opioid crises and just people dying left and right on me, and then we have nothing, right? And so where are the jobs now? The other thing is I think that we need to be careful about things that can sound sort of abstract. And so, it's partly a fight over semantics and discourse and within parties and about factions. All of those things are true, but it's also a fact that many of us are coming into these ideas and the ability to act on them for the first time, and not all of us even have the infrastructure to build out our visions. We're just doing, a lot of this is new, right? And so people are coming to understand these things when you're dealing with new ideas. Not all of them are fleshed out. Not all of them are clear. Some of them actually are much clearer than people would suspect. I mean, I think the Green New Deal initiatives they actually have like a huge amount of purchase, but finding ways that they connect with people is going to be a long-term project.
This leads me to ask about this essay that you published in the fall Design and Luxury issue of T, the New York Times. And it's called Design for the Future When the Future is Bleak. And I was really struck by the premise. How do you design for the future when the future you are designing for will not exist? You attacked that in a variety of really thoughtful ways, sort of a non-dystopian, dystopian view that encouraged us to look really courageously at what is actually happening to people, what is actually happening to the planet, and what is actually happening to each other.
Yeah, I have to say, this comes from some research I had been doing just about the history of design as an idea, that it had, especially industrial design and things like that, it was really becoming a profession in the 1920s and 30s. I think that there was a lot of just hope invested in it because, it wasn't just product. It was cities. It was, if you visited the World's Fair in 1939 in New York, there, a lot of industrial designers produced these exhibits about the future. That conception of the future, we can't really have that anymore. I think there's been, it's been challenged in any number of different ways by the early environmental movement, the anti-nuclear movement. And so, I've been helped a lot in thinking through this by a lot of figures in and around the Green New Deal movement. sociologists, people who come actually in some ways out of design or housing or whatever, and then sort of reflected on those professions within the current context. And I want to say I feel that one thing that movement has helped me to feel, and it has changed my life, honestly. I wouldn't say that I was a climate activist, and I mean, but I campaigned very heavily on it and believe very strongly in the initiatives around a Green New Deal now. It helped me to feel optimistic about it, actually. One thing that the movement holds and the policies hold is that our lives can actually be better. We're not going to be retreating from a certain kind of quality of life. It points to the way that all of our lives are actually really damaged by not having enacted strong transit or having toxic schools as we do in Philadelphia, by citing those schools near landfill or near incinerators. I mean, you start to then think about your world in environmental or climatological terms, and you're like, well, this is terrible. This is the so-called quality of life that we all are like trying to protect. No, we need to transform all of us entirely. When you look at some of the better green buildings that have been produced, like Via Verde in the Bronx, and I mean, some of these places across the country, they are better buildings. So even though that piece is about survival, I think it's also about uniting our social movements with the design professions.
I read a review in the London Review of Books by Jenny Diskey, in which she talked about something that you write about quite thoughtfully, which is, and I'm going to quote her, she writes, the design and construction of entire purpose-built structures for office work is a modern phenomenon. So this idea of this sort of unified, centralized, almost dogmatic specificity, kind of Mad Men offices come to mind, is in many ways the opposite of the kind of diversity and eclecticism you're talking about now in your work. But it also speaks to this question of what is modern. I'm curious about this, whether, to come back to you for a moment, what it means to be a modern senator in a modern world.
Listeners, he's rubbing his temples.
It's just I don't know. It's what is modernity? I don't know. It's a really good question. God, it's hard to answer. I would say on the one hand, I have always, and it's not great to be answering a question about modernity with confessions of nostalgia, but I have always felt, to be honest, somewhat nostalgic for the forward-thinking nature of the kind of New Deal era or what have you. And there are varieties of this. It doesn't have to be like the mainstream. There's Afrofuturism. There's like lots of different kinds of varieties that are inflected of conceiving of the future, but just some way of thinking about the world that is optimistic, I would say. And, I thought that the political right had captured this for a long time, that actually in the Reagan era, and for several years after that, there was this sense that the future belonged to them, and they had this, there were these gargantuan projects like Star Wars, the kind of, the missile defense programs and things like that, the nuclear arms race. I mean, there was just ways in which the left had been consigned to retrograde vision, and the right had the future in its grasp. And I guess I feel like we need a left, or we need a government that regains that sense of like, here is the future that we're offering. And I don't know that we have that yet. The kind of personal optimism is I do feel like there is a real desire to confront it and figure it out on the part of elected officials, a growing number of them. I would not have thought that the state Senate office is a place where you do that. And now, and I hope it is. I hope, I've put a lot of work into this, and so I really hope it is. But I just have seen other people and in New York State and various places where I just thought, wow, look at what they're doing there. That's great. I mean, whether it's a small piece of energy policy or just a large tenants' rights bill or whatever, I just think, great. They're confronting the world as it is. They're trying to be equal to the time they're living in. You can build a future in these places. So to the extent that we can produce a vision for a society that is protective, that cares for people, that is built on care and caring for one another. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about this, but one of the things that we really ran on and as a campaign, and I care about as a senator, is just enhancing the life of caregivers and the care that they produce. So long-term elder care and child care is just key parts of our society that tend to be undervalued. but then building a future for people. Like, can we build housing again? Can we do it well? Can we do it in ways that reflect all the concerns for dignity that were ignored, I would say, in many previous efforts? Can we sustain our planet? And can we make it hospitable for more people than it is right now? I mean, that's modernity. I think it's like, I don't, I think we can regain our sense of futurity if we can keep both impulses in view, the impulse to care for what we have and the impulse to build more for more people.
You have your work cut out for you, Nikhil, and I can think of no one more suited to the job to lead us forward. This has been a marvelous conversation. Thank you so much for making time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. I've loved this. It's been super thought-provoking, and thank you.
And this is the last episode of Season 8. Thanks to all our guests, to MailChimp for their support, and to all of you who are listening. Jessica, let's talk a little bit about what's coming up.
What's coming up is more of what came up today, I hope. This was sort of a wonderful start to a conversation that I really think is just starting about design in the world, design in public policy, design and doing good, design and helping others.
That's what I left with today. We need to rewrite the story because right now we are in a tough place as a society, as individuals, as communities, as families, in the workplace. Design plays a big role in radically imagining a better ending for all of us. I'm really excited.
I sometimes think design in business is a misnomer. And yet now I'm thinking this is our opportunity, all of us together with all of our guests and with you and me, to really rethink what design means, what business means, what they mean together, and how we can do a better job at all of it.
I'm looking forward to all of it. The Design of Business, the Business of Design is a podcast from Design Observer. Our website is dbbd.designobserver.com. There you can find more information about today's guest, Nikhil Saval, plus conversations with dozens of other people about the transformative role design plays in their business. To listen, go to dbbd.designobserver.com.
If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to this podcast. You can find The Design of Business, the Business of Design in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or however you listen to podcasts.
And if you're already a subscriber to the podcast, thanks. Please tell your friends or go to Apple Podcasts and rate us, which is a great way to let other people know about the podcast.
Between episodes, you can keep up with Design Observer on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And please consider subscribing to Race Ahead, my regular column on race and leadership at fortune.com/getraceahead.
Mike Erica wrote our theme music. Julie Subrin edits the show. Our interns are Adina Karp and Lena Yao. And our executive producer is Blake Eskin of Noun and Verb Rodeo.
Be well, everyone.
Stay safe, stay home.